The envelope hit the table with a sharp slap, scattering the salt shaker and rattling the chipped ceramic plate that had been sitting there since lunch. My father leaned back in his chair, arms folded, and smirked at me like he'd just pulled off the cleverest trick in the world. "Don't look at me like that," he said, voice dripping with mockery. "You should be grateful. I used your tuition money for the family." Family. That word twisted in my chest like a rusty knife. This isn't just a story, it's a journey of betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimate revenge. Stay with me until the end because every detail matters. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just stared at him, at the half-empty glass of whiskey beside his hand, at the yellowed playing cards tucked under the coaster, at the greasy fingerprints smearing the envelope that had once held my future. My body shook but my face stayed calm. Calm in the way that makes men like him nervous, though he didn't know it yet. Because while he thought he'd stolen my chance, I knew something he didn't. Something I wasn't ready to show him yet. The clock above the stove ticked past 8:17 p.m., each second heavier than the last. The kitchen smelled faintly of fried onions and cigarette smoke, the wallpaper stained with years of neglect. The television in the living room buzzed low, the hum of a late-night game show filling the silence between us. My father leaned forward, his chair creaking under his weight. "I kept a roof over your head. Food on your plate. And this is how you repay me?" With that face. My hands tightened around the edge of the table. My nails dug into the wood, tracing the same grooves I'd made years ago when I was 12 and too scared to speak up. But I wasn't 12 anymore. "I saw the receipts," I said quietly. For a moment the smirk wavered. Just a flicker. Then it returned wider, crueler. "Receipts don't tell stories. I told you I did it for the family." Family. He said it again as if repeating it would make it true. The truth was sitting in my purse upstairs. Crumpled papers, each one reeking of stale smoke and broken promises. A folded scholarship letter he'd hidden from me. Bank withdrawals, dates circled in red. Casino receipts stuffed carelessly inside, some with smeared ink from spilled beer. He thought he'd buried them deep in the attic box, hidden between old coats and moldy photo albums. But I had been there. At 3 a.m. when the house was quiet, I'd climbed up that creaking ladder, flashlight shaking in my hand. I'd opened that box, heart pounding, and seen the proof of every lie he ever told. And tonight, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, I carried that knowledge like a weapon tucked beneath my coat. I watched him chew on the corner of his lip, a nervous tic he never admitted he had. He pulled a cigarette from the crumpled pack beside him, lit it with a flick of his old silver lighter, and blew smoke into the air like he was king of the castle. "You're ungrateful," he muttered, shaking his head. "You'll see one day. Everything I did was for you." I tilted my head. "Funny," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The casino didn't look like family to me." His cigarette paused midair. For the first time the smirk slipped. The silence stretched, thick and uneasy. In the distance I could hear the neighbor's dog barking, a train horn faintly echoing through the night. Inside, the only sound was the slow, uneven drag of his breath and the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. He set the cigarette down, stubbed it into the ashtray with more force than necessary. "Watch your mouth," he said, though the edge of his voice trembled. I didn't flinch. I leaned forward, elbows on the table meeting his eyes. His pupils darted, the confidence draining inch by inch. He wanted to intimidate me like he always had. But this time I wasn't shrinking back. What he didn't know, what he couldn't even imagine, was that the papers upstairs weren't just stuffed into my purse. Copies were already in safe places. A file folder hidden under my bed. Another tucked away at a friend's house across town. And one sealed envelope mailed to an address he would never think to check. He thought he had control. He had no idea it was already slipping through his fingers. The kitchen light buzzed overhead, one bulb flickering weakly. Shadows stretched across his face, making him look older, weaker, like the man he pretended to be was already unraveling. He reached for the whiskey glass, knocked it back in one gulp, and slammed it on the table hard enough to make the salt shaker jump. "Ungrateful," he repeated, louder this time, as if volume could make it truth. "Everything I did, everything I sacrificed, and this is the thanks I get?" I studied him, the sweat beading along his hairline, the way his hands shook when he reached for the bottle again. He wasn't as steady as he used to be. The years of drinking, of late-night games and smoky backrooms, were finally carving lines into his face. For the first time I saw him not as an untouchable giant, but as a man crumbling under the weight of his own lies. And that realization lit a fire inside me. I remembered being 17, clutching my acceptance letter, dreaming of walking across a campus with books in my arms and a future in my hands. I remembered his laugh, sharp, dismissive, as he told me girls like me didn't need college, that I should be thankful for what I had. I remembered crying into my pillow, hiding the sound so my mother wouldn't hear, telling myself maybe he was right. But tonight, watching him unravel across the table, I knew he wasn't right. He was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if I stopped believing his lies. And he was right to be afraid. He leaned forward again, trying to regain ground. His voice dropped low, almost conspiratorial. "You think you know something, don't you? You think you're smarter than me?" I didn't answer. I just stared. Because I did know something. Something he wasn't ready to hear. The sound of the clock ticked louder, almost mocking. The air between us grew heavy, thick with words unsaid. My hands stayed folded neatly in my lap, my breathing steady, even as my heart pounded hard enough to hurt. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to throw the papers on the table, to watch his face crumble as the truth laid him bare. But not yet. Timing mattered. And I had patience. Outside, the wind rattled the branches against the window, a hollow scratching that matched the unease crawling under my skin. I could feel the tension building, like a storm pressing against the walls of the house. He thought he was in control. He thought this was just another night, another argument he could win by shouting louder, by laughing at my pain. But I wasn't the same girl who once cried in silence. This time I had the upper hand. His eyes narrowed. "You've got that look," he said, pointing at me with a shaky finger. "That smug little look. You think you can outsmart me? You think you can embarrass me?" I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I let him stew in his own paranoia, feeding it with my silence. Because silence is louder than shouting when you know something the other person doesn't. Finally, he shoved his chair back, the legs scraping across the worn linoleum. "You don't know anything," he snapped, though his voice cracked. I smiled just a little. "Don't I?" The kitchen felt colder suddenly, though the heater clicked on in the living room. My arms prickled with goosebumps, but not from fear, from anticipation. Because in that moment, watching him struggle to hold on to his fading authority, I realized something important. He wasn't untouchable anymore. He was vulnerable. And he didn't even know how close he was to losing everything. I stood up slowly, the chair sliding back behind me. His eyes followed me, searching for answers he wasn't going to get tonight. I walked past him, calm, deliberate, and paused at the doorway. He barked, "Where do you think you're going?" I turned my head just enough for him to see the edge of my smile. "You'll find out soon enough." And with that, I left him sitting in the flickering kitchen light, alone with his empty glass and the first taste of fear. That was the last thing I told him before I walked out of the kitchen, leaving him to stew in his own silence. My footsteps echoed down the hallway, each creak of the floorboards louder than it should have been. The house felt heavy, almost pressing against me, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of every argument, every secret, every word we never said. I didn't head straight to my room. Instead, I climbed the narrow staircase toward the attic, the air colder with each step. Dust tickled my throat and the wood groaned under my weight. I'd been up here before, but tonight was different. Tonight I wasn't searching blindly. I knew exactly what I needed and I knew where to find it. The attic door stuck at first, swollen with age and humidity, but with a hard push it opened. A stale wave of air hit me, dry and musty, smelling faintly of mothballs and old wood. I pulled the chain and the single bulb flickered to life, casting weak light across stacks of boxes, old trunks and forgotten furniture draped in yellowed sheets. Shadows stretched long across the beams, moving as though they were alive. I stepped carefully between stacks of newspapers tied with brittle string. My eyes scanned the space until they landed on the old cedar chest shoved against the far wall. It looked innocent enough, like something a family might keep quilts in. But I knew better. I'd been here once before, weeks ago, when curiosity got the best of me. What I found then was enough to shatter the last fragments of trust one had left. And tonight I needed more. Kneeling before the chest, I pressed my fingers under the lid and lifted. The hinges squeaked, loud enough to make me flinch, as though the sound might travel downstairs and give me away. Inside, a jumble of forgotten life spilled out. Old jackets, faded photographs, broken toys from my childhood. For a moment the sight pulled at me, a strange ache of memory and betrayal tangled together. How many family treasures had been shoved in here, suffocated under the weight of what he wanted to hide? I pushed aside the clutter, my fingers brushing against something sharp. A folder. The cardboard was soft and worn at the edges, stuffed so full it barely closed. I pulled it free, my hands trembling despite the chill in the air. Inside were papers. So many papers. Bank slips, withdrawal records, IOUs scrawled in his uneven handwriting. Names I didn't recognize, numbers that twisted my stomach into knots. Some receipts still smelled faintly of smoke, as if the stench of the casino had followed them home. But this time something new caught my eye. A letter. Still sealed, but the envelope was thin and fragile with age. My name was printed neatly on the front, the college emblem in the corner. My breath caught. I tore it open carefully, the paper crinkling as I unfolded it. Congratulations. That was all I needed to see. It was a scholarship offer. The one I never received. The one that could have changed everything. He hadn't just stolen my money, he'd stolen my chance. He must have hidden the letter before I even saw it. My vision blurred, the words swimming on the page. For a moment I had to sit back, my chest heaving as the truth settled over me like a weight too heavy to lift. He hadn't made a mistake. He hadn't been desperate. He had chosen to bury my future here in the dark while he gambled away his nights. The bulb above me flickered and I froze, heart thudding. The house creaked as if someone had shifted downstairs. For a second I thought I heard footsteps. I held my breath, clutching the papers to my chest, and waited. Silence. Just the groan of wood settling in the cold. Still I moved quickly, sliding the letter and the thickest stack of receipts into my bag. I knew better than to take everything at once. He would notice. He always noticed. But he couldn't track what he didn't know I had. I closed the chest, making sure the jackets and broken toys lay exactly as I found them. I'd learned the hard way that with him, even the smallest detail could spark suspicion. As I made my way back down the stairs, the house felt alive with secrets. Every creak of the steps, every flicker of light felt like a warning. I half expected him to be waiting at the bottom, cigarette in hand, ready with some cruel remark. But the hallway was empty. The kitchen light still glowed faintly under the doorframe, but the sound of the TV had gone silent. Either he had passed out or he was waiting in the dark, stewing in the words I'd left him with. I slipped into my room and closed the door quietly, sliding the lock into place. My lamp gave off a soft golden glow, far warmer than the buzzing attic bulb. I sat on the edge of my bed, spreading the papers across the quilt. Scholarship letter. Receipts. Debt notes. Each piece was another nail in the coffin of his lies. And I was the one holding the hammer. For a long while I just sat there staring at them. Part of me wanted to cry, to curl up and let the grief wash over me. But another part, stronger now, kept whispering, not yet. Not here. Instead I pulled out a small notebook from my nightstand. I began to write. Dates. Amounts. Notes scribbled in the margins about what I'd seen, what I'd heard. Every scrap of evidence had a place. Every discovery a line in my growing record. It wasn't just for me anymore. It was for anyone who might doubt me later, for anyone who might try to twist the truth. I wanted it all down in black and white, undeniable. As I wrote, the knot in my chest loosened. For the first time I wasn't just surviving his betrayal, I was preparing. A soft knock on my door startled me, the pencil slipping in my hand. I shoved the papers under my pillow and snapped the notebook closed. Yeah. My voice came out steadier than I felt. It was my mother's voice, faint and tired. Are you all right? My throat tightened. He didn't know. Or maybe she did in her own way and chose not to see. Years of silence had trained her well. I'm fine, I lied, forcing lightness into my tone. Just studying. Pause. Then her footsteps retreated down the hall. I let out a long breath, the kind that feels like it empties more than just your lungs. When the house finally fell silent, no footsteps, no muttered curses, no clinking glass, I lay back against my pillow, staring at the ceiling. The shadows from my lamp stretched across the plaster, twisting and shifting with every movement of my chest. I thought about that letter. The congratulations I never read. The life I might have lived if he hadn't buried it in the attic. And then I thought about the folder still up there waiting for me to return. There were more secrets hidden in that chest. More lies to uncover. I could feel it. And each one was another thread unraveling the man who thought he could laugh while he stole my future. He had no idea how close he was to being exposed. And when the time came, I wasn't just going to confront him. I was going to make sure he could never laugh again. That thought carried me through the sleepless nights, through the quiet hours when the house seemed to hold its breath, through the endless sorting of papers under the weak glow of my lamp. Each scrap of evidence I collected, each note I wrote, felt like laying another stone in a path that only led one way, toward the courtroom. By the time the summons arrived, folded neatly inside its cream envelope, I wasn't surprised. I almost welcomed it. The sound of the mail slot clattering that morning made my pulse quicken, not with fear but with a strange, steady calm. I slipped the envelope into my bag before anyone else could see and carried it upstairs like a secret treasure. The day itself arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning where the air feels sharp in your lungs and every sound echoes louder than it should. I stood in front of my mirror, smoothing the creases of the simple navy dress I had chosen. Nothing fancy, just clean, respectful, unshakable. My hands trembled slightly as I pinned my hair back, but my eyes in the glass were steady. When I walked down the stairs, the house was silent. My mother sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cold mug of coffee she hadn't touched. She looked up at me with a question in her eyes she didn't dare speak. My father's chair was empty, but the ashtray was full and the stale smell of smoke hung thick in the air. I didn't say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. The courthouse loomed larger than I remembered, its stone steps worn smooth by years of footsteps. The air inside smelled faintly of polish and old paper, a mix of authority and dust. My heels clicked softly on the tiled floor as I walked down the corridor, past doors labeled with brass plates, past strangers in suits and uniforms who didn't know my story but would soon hear pieces of it. I found my seat in the gallery, papers clutched in my bag like armor. My fingers brushed the edge of the scholarship letter, the faded ink almost humming with the weight of what it represented. I breathed in slowly, counting to 4 and let it out. The bailiff called his name. My father walked in, shoulders squared, chin lifted like he owned the room. He wore the same suit he'd worn to every wedding and funeral, the fabric shiny at the elbows, the tie slightly crooked. But his eyes darted, sharp and restless, scanning the room until they landed on me. And that smirk. The same one he wore at the kitchen table, the one that said he thought he still held the strings. The judge entered, robes swaying, and the room rose in unison. My knees wobbled as I stood, but I pressed them firm, refusing to let him see weakness. When we sat again, the wooden bench was cold beneath me, grounding me in the moment. The opening words blurred together at first. The formalities, the process, the language of law that seemed more ritual than real. But then the questions began, and suddenly it was real. My father's voice filled the room, louder than necessary, tinged with arrogance. "I did what I had to do," he said, leaning forward as if to make his words carry more weight. "Everything I spent, everything I chose, it was for my family. For her." His finger jabbed in my direction. Heat flushed my cheeks, but I kept my gaze steady. "For her education. For her future," the attorney pressed. "For her survival," he snapped back. "She doesn't understand what it takes to keep a house standing. What it costs." I wanted to laugh. Or maybe cry. But instead I reached into my bag and pulled out the first envelope. My hand shook only slightly as I passed it forward, the crisp sound of paper against wood echoing louder than I expected. "Please explain this," the attorney said, sliding the casino receipt across the table toward him. My father's jaw tightened. His lips pressed thin, the smirk cracking just slightly at the edges. "That doesn't prove anything," he muttered. But there were more. So many more. Each slip another brick pulled from the wall he had built around his lies. Each piece a thread unraveling the story he clung to. And then the scholarship letter. When it landed in front of him, the silence in the room deepened, heavy and sharp. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You withheld this?" My father shifted in his seat. "She wouldn't have managed it. She wasn't ready." The words hit me like stones, but I didn't flinch. I let them hang in the air, let them show everyone exactly who he was. From my seat, I could see the sweat gathering at his temples, the way his fingers tapped restlessly against the table. He tried to laugh, to wave it all away, but the sound rang hollow, cracking at the edges. The attorney pressed again. "So the casino charges, the debts in your name, these were all for your daughter's benefit?" He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The smirk faltered, the arrogance slipping like a mask that no longer fit. His gaze darted back to me, searching for something. Fear, hesitation, forgiveness. But I gave him nothing. The judge's gavel struck once, the sound reverberating through the room. Order. My pulse hammered in my ears. I felt every beat, every breath, as though the air itself had thickened. This wasn't the end. Not yet. But for the first time he wasn't the one in control. He shifted in his chair, the swagger gone, and for a fleeting moment, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. A fear he had spent years hiding behind laughter, behind smoke and whiskey and bravado. And that fear fed me. It steadied my hands, calmed my breath, anchored me in a way nothing else could. The rest of the proceedings blurred into a rhythm of questions and answers, of evidence sliding across the table, of objections and rulings. But what I remember most wasn't the words. It was his silence. When pressed too far, when shown too much, he stopped speaking. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, and the room filled with the sound of his defeat. I sat there, still as stone, watching the man who once controlled every corner of my life shrink under the weight of truth. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. But it was the beginning of his unraveling. When the session ended, the scrape of benches and shuffle of feet filled the room. People whispered, papers rustled, doors opened and closed. I stayed seated, my hands folded in my lap, until the gallery emptied around me. My father stood slowly, his shoulders sagging, his eyes no longer daring to meet mine. For the first time he looked small. As he passed by, the faint scent of smoke clung to him, mixed with the sour tang of sweat. He muttered something under his breath, too low for anyone else to hear but clear enough for me. This isn't over. My stomach tightened, but I didn't move. I let him walk away, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Because deep down I knew he was right. It wasn't over. Not yet. That thought clung to me like the smell of smoke on my clothes as I stepped back into the evening air outside the courthouse. The sky was low and heavy, clouds pressing down, the kind of gray that made the streetlights flicker on before their time. I tightened my coat around me, though the chill I felt wasn't just from the weather. The walk home was long and heavy. Every step echoed with the memory of his muttered words, the warning in his tone. By the time I reached our front porch, the sun had slipped behind the houses, leaving the neighborhood in that dim half-light where everything feels uncertain. I opened the door and the house was waiting. The smell of fried onions hit me first, sharp and greasy, mixing with the faint trace of smoke that never seemed to leave the walls. The kitchen light glowed too bright, throwing long shadows into the hallway. My mother sat at the table, her hands folded tight, her eyes fixed on the door as if she had been waiting all day for it to open. "You were gone too long," she said. Her voice wasn't angry, just tired, the kind of tired that sits deep in the bones. "I was at the courthouse," I answered, my throat dry. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't ask how it went. He didn't want to know. From the back room I heard the creak of floorboards. My father's steps, slow, deliberate. My stomach twisted as he appeared in the doorway, his shoulders still squared, his chin lifted as if he had just walked off a battlefield. "Well," he said, his voice carrying that false cheer that made the hair on my neck rise. "Our little actress has returned." He dropped his coat over the chair, his eyes fixed on me with that same smirk he'd worn in the courtroom, only now it was sharper, meaner. "You think you embarrassed me today?" he asked, loosening his tie with a tug that made the fabric snap. "You think waving a few scraps of paper makes you strong?" I didn't answer. I set my bag on the table, my fingers brushing the edge of the scholarship letter still tucked safely inside. My silence seemed to fuel him. He stepped closer, his shoes clicking against the worn linoleum. "You've forgotten whose roof you're under," he said, his voice low, dangerous. My mother shifted in her chair. "Please," she whispered, her hands trembling against the wood. "Not here. Not now." But he didn't stop. He never stopped. That night turned into a storm. He ranted for hours, pacing the kitchen, knocking over a glass, slamming his fist against the counter. Each word was another blow, aimed to bruise without leaving marks. He called me ungrateful, foolish, reckless. He told me I had no idea what I was doing, no idea what kind of world waited outside these walls. But underneath the bluster I saw it. The fear. He was losing control and he knew it. When he finally stormed upstairs, the house shook with the slam of his door. My mother sat frozen, her hands pressed against her face. I moved to her side, placing my hand gently over hers. "We'll be all right," I said softly, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. She shook her head. "You don't understand. He doesn't forget. He doesn't forgive." The days that followed were a quiet kind of war. He barely spoke to me at breakfast, though his eyes never left me. I felt them burning into me with every bite of toast, every sip of coffee. At night, I heard him pacing the hallway, the floorboards groaning under his steps. Sometimes he paused outside my door, and the silence that followed was worse than any shouting. I started locking the door. One morning, I found my scholarship letter missing from my bag. My heart dropped and I tore through drawers, shelves, stacks of books. When I finally found it, crumpled in the trash beneath yesterday's newspaper, my hands shook with rage. I smoothed the paper flat again, pressing out the wrinkles, but the crease marks remained like scars. He wanted to erase me. And I couldn't let him. But the fallout wasn't just inside the house. Word spread in the neighborhood. Court whispers travel fast. At the grocery store, Mrs. Patterson avoided my eyes, shuffling past me with her basket. At church, conversations hushed when I walked by, voices dropping into the kind of silence that cuts deeper than words. I realized then how carefully he had crafted his mask in public. To them he was still the hard-working man, the father who sacrificed for his family. And I was the troublemaker, the ungrateful daughter dragging his name through the mud. It stung, but it also steeled me. If they couldn't see the truth, I would make them. One evening, I caught my mother standing at the sink, staring out the window, her shoulders slumped. The dishwater had gone cold, suds clinging weakly to the rim of the basin. "Why don't you leave him?" I asked before I could stop myself. She flinched, her hands tightening around the edge of the sink. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" My voice cracked, rising sharper than I intended. "He ruins everything. He lies, he steals, he—" "Because I made vows," she interrupted, her eyes wet but fierce. "Because this house, this life, it's all I know. And because," she stopped, her voice breaking, "because I'm afraid." Her words hung heavy in the air. I wanted to argue, to beg her to see reason. But I saw the truth in her eyes. Fear had tied her to him tighter than any vow. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the wind scrape against the shutters, I realized something. If I wanted freedom, I couldn't wait for her to find courage. I couldn't wait for him to hand it over. I would have to take it. The tension in the house grew like a storm waiting to break. He watched me constantly, his smirk gone, replaced with something colder, sharper. My mother tiptoed through rooms, flinching at every sound. Me. I kept my bag packed, my papers hidden, my resolve sharpening like a blade. The fallout was ugly, relentless. But in that ugliness I found clarity. He could rage, he could threaten, he could tear my future into pieces. But he couldn't stop me from seeing who he really was. And once you see the truth, you can never unsee it. When he cornered me in the hallway one night, blocking my path with his shadow, I stood tall. His breath reeked of whiskey, his eyes narrowed, but I didn't flinch. "You think you've won," he hissed. I met his stare, steady, calm. "Not yet," I said. The words slipped out before I could catch them, but I didn't regret them. Because they were true. Not yet. The words hung in the hallway like smoke, heavier than anything I'd ever spoken to him. His eyes narrowed, his face tightening as though he hadn't expected me to say them. For a moment I thought he'd strike me. His fists clenched, his shoulders rose. But then he smirked, that same hollow smirk, and stepped aside. I walked past him without looking back. But inside something shifted. That was the last time he would block my way. The next morning I rose before dawn. The house was still, the air cold against my skin. My mother was asleep in her chair in the living room, a thin blanket pulled up to her chin. She looked small there, her face drawn, her lips moving faintly as though she were whispering something in her dreams. I wanted to cover her better, to tuck her in like she once tucked me in, but I didn't dare wake her. Instead, I went to my room, pulled my bag from beneath the bed, and opened it one last time. The scholarship letter, the receipts, the statements, they were all there, smoothed flat and stacked neatly. Proof of his lies. Proof of my truth. My hands lingered on the edges, steady now. I wasn't afraid anymore. I slipped the bag over my shoulder and stood tall. Today would not be loud. But it would be final. At the courthouse, the air buzzed with the same low hum I remembered, but this time I felt different. Stronger. The floor no longer seemed to tilt beneath me. The papers in my bag weren't just evidence anymore. They were anchors. When I entered the courtroom, he was already there, sitting stiff in his chair, his hands folded tightly together. His suit was the same, but his face looked worn, lined deeper than before. His eyes darted toward me, then away, like he couldn't bear the weight of mine. The judge's voice carried through the room, steady and firm. "We will resume where we left off." And so it began. The questions came sharper this time. The attorney pressed harder, piece after piece, each document laid bare under the harsh light. My father's answers grew shorter, his voice rougher, the bravado slipping. At one point he tried to laugh it off again. "These papers don't prove anything. She's twisting everything." But then I stood. My knees wobbled, but my voice did not. "They prove enough," I said. My words rang through the room, steadier than I thought possible. "They prove that you took what wasn't yours. They prove that you ruined what was mine. And they prove that you never thought I'd stand here today." Silence followed. Heavy, unbroken. The judge's eyes turned toward him. "Do you have anything to say in response?" My father opened his mouth. No sound came. His jaw worked, his eyes narrowed, but nothing formed. For the first time his silence wasn't power. It was defeat. The gavel struck. The decision was made. I heard the words: restitution, penalties, acknowledgement of misconduct. But they blurred into a single ringing truth. I had won. Not just in court, not just on paper. I had won because he couldn't take my future anymore. He couldn't hide it, couldn't burn it, couldn't laugh it away. When it ended, I stood, my hands steady at my sides. He remained seated, slumped slightly, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. No smirk. No swagger. Just a hollow shell of the man who had once towered over me. I walked past him without hesitation. He didn't look up. He didn't dare. Outside, the air was crisp, the sunlight breaking through the clouds at last. I breathed it in deep, filling my lungs, letting it settle into every corner of me. The courthouse steps stretched ahead, each one carrying me farther from him, closer to myself. But the fallout at home wasn't over yet. That evening I returned to the house one last time. The walls seemed smaller, the rooms darker, as though the house itself knew its hold on me was ending. He was in the kitchen, slouched at the table, a bottle at his elbow. His eyes lifted when I entered, red-rimmed and hollow. "So," he muttered, his voice low, gravelly. "You think you've destroyed me?" I set my bag on the counter. "No," I said simply. "You did that yourself." His laugh was bitter, sharp, but it faded quickly. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. "You'll regret this," he said. But there was no conviction in it, no fire. Only the echo of a man who once believed he could control everything. I stepped closer, my voice calm, steady. "The difference is I won't." My mother appeared in the doorway then, her face pale, her eyes wide. She looked between us, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. "It's over," I told her gently. "He can't take anything else from us." Tears welled in her eyes, silent, unsteady. She nodded once, then lowered her gaze. I walked past them both, down the hallway into my room. I picked up the last of my things, just a suitcase, worn but sturdy. My hand lingered on the doorknob, tracing the grooves where years of turning had worn the wood smooth. And then I stepped out, closing it behind me. The night air was cool, the street quiet. I rolled my suitcase down the cracked sidewalk, each click of the wheels marking a step toward freedom. The neighborhood looked the same, familiar porches, glowing windows, the hum of crickets, but it felt different now. Lighter. I reached the corner and paused, looking back once. The house stood in shadow, its windows dark, its secrets sealed inside. For years it had been a cage. Tonight it was just a building. I turned away. The weeks that followed were a blur of new beginnings. I signed the acceptance papers, the scholarship secured at last. I packed for the life I had almost lost, the life he tried to bury. Each form filled, each box checked felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. But more than that, I found a new kind of quiet. A quiet not built on fear but on peace. I no longer listened for footsteps in the hall at night. I no longer jumped when the door slammed. The silence was mine. Looking back, my victory wasn't loud. There were no cheers, no applause, no crowd waiting to celebrate. It was quiet, steady, final. It was in the way he couldn't meet my eyes in the courtroom. In the way his smirk dissolved into silence. In the way the house no longer held me. He thought he could laugh away my future. He thought he could take it, twist it, own it. But in the end I walked away with it still in my hands. And that, I realized, was the truest victory of all. Because revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it walks out the door and never looks back. And sometimes it ends with nothing more than a single steady breath. Knowing he'll never laugh at me again. If this story left you breathless, imagine what's coming next. Subscribe now, because every week we share powerful revenge stories that women like you will never forget.